Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改
变世界.
Change organizations.
Change the world.
I'd like to welcome you all to the panel on Constitutions, Institutions, and the Rule of Law. We have a wonderful set of panelists, perhaps among the foremost thinkers on this field from a variety of different parts of the world. To begin with, we have Beatriz Magaloni, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford and a director of the Poverty and Governance Program in the Center for Development, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. Professor Magaloni is a leading expert on Mexico's transition from a single-party rule, 71 years of the PRI, to multi-party democracy, both how it happened and what its implications are. So thank you very much for coming. We also have Mr. Trevor Manuel, who I introduced yesterday. It's a shame I can't do justice to all the honors and wonderful things that each of these individuals have done, so I'll have to keep it short but sweet. Mr. Manuel is the chairman of South Africa's Planning Commission and a long-term finance minister in South Africa's post-apartheid government. He's garnered many honors for his role in South Africa's remarkable twin post-apartheid achievements in economic reintegration, both around the world, as well as national reconciliation within the country. He's also served as a chairman of the board of the governors of the IMF and a chair of the Development Committee of the World Bank. Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Manuel. Vivek Maru is the CEO of Namati, a new international organization dedicated to legal empowerment. Prior to launching Namati, Vivek worked as senior counsel in the Justice Reform Group of the World Bank. He also co-founded and co-directed Team Up for Justice, a grassroots justice program in Sierra Leone. Clearly another post-conflict, post-transition environment. So thank you very much, Mr. Maru. Professor Meghan O Sullivan is the former Deputy National Security Advisor on Iraq and Afghanistan, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and the Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government. Among her many roles in her long and distinguished public service career, she was also as chief advisor to the presidential envoy in the Northern Ireland peace process, and she's currently advising the Romney campaign. So thank you very much for coming, Professor O'Sullivan. This panel is going to be a discussion, as you can see, between both academics and policymakers on the lessons learned from past examples of post-transition nation building and how they apply to the current situations unfolding around the world. We've asked our panelists to comment on the following questions. What are the most critical steps in the creation of a stable post-transition government? To what degree does the form of government, for example, dictatorship, democracy, centralized, decentralized, have on the successful creation of a stable nation state? And finally, to comment on the challenges of the creation of new constitutional arrangements and the rule of law in societies emerging from dictatorial or single-party systems. Each panelist will have around 10 minutes for opening remarks. Then we'll have a short moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Well, thank you very much, and please.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, Sumitra. So I want to begin by giving a very general and broad context about Latin America, and then I want to try to land on Mexico and talk about the two big research agendas that I'm currently working on, which deal with poverty reduction and criminal violence, and somehow try to link that to transitions. so just to give you a broad picture of Latin America, there are three stylized facts about Latin American transitions. One is that in the post-war era, Latin America has been characterized as one of the most unstable regions in the world. And by instability, I don't refer to having a lot of civil wars, but a lot of transitions from autocracy to democracy and back again. So that's one of the big traits of Latin America. The other thing is the presence of military dictatorships, a very prevalent form of dictatorships, very different to, let's say, if you think about Africa, where you have more of single-party dictatorship presence. And the third one is the fact that Latin America began to experience with democracy very early. So think of, for example, Guatemala in 1954. There was a coup, and this country was very poor. Similarly to Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, countries in Latin America at very early stages of development were experimenting with democracy. And that in part account for one of the reasons why this region has been so unstable. We know from the literature that democracy is very hard to establish in poor countries. India is another exception. And in part that explains why Latin America had it very hard. There are two other reasons that explain this broad pattern. One is inequality, and the work by Carles Bosch here has shown that it's very hard to establish democracy in very unequal countries, and basically the reason why this is the case is that when the poor get the right to vote, there is always the possibility that they are going to vote for radical redistribution. And then the rich are going to seek protection, which in Latin America most often happen in the hands of the military for their assets. And the third reason is really related to something exogenous that I don't think has been sufficiently emphasized, which is the role of the United States and geopolitical conditions, and how much the Cold War at the time justify on the part of the US the support of military regimes that promised to contain the expansion of communism on the one hand, and on the other, the presence of the Cuban Revolution and how much that worked to radicalize the left in Latin America. So this is really, one needs to understand this context to understand why democracy was so hard to establish, why so many military regimes came to take power, and also why democracy took hold in the region. After the end of the Cold War, all of a sudden, everybody transited to democracy, and actually, the region has been broadly democratic with some exceptions, Cuba, and now Venezuela with some backlashes and so on, but unexpectedly for the literature, because the region is, well, not all the region, but there are still poor countries, for example, Guatemala, Bolivia, that have been stable under democracy. So this is the broad picture that I wanted to emphasize. And out of this broad picture, Mexico is a little bit different because Mexico didn't have this story of military dictatorships. And actually, the dictatorship in Mexico, or the authoritarian regime, governed. The rhetoric of the regime was that they were governing in the benefit of the poor, which is a very different form of authoritarian regime. Very similar to Hugo Chavez today, although with less radicalism, the Mexican PRI. So the Mexican PRI has been characterized as the perfect dictatorship because they always appeared to be democratic. They were having elections, but only one party won. So the transition in Mexico was not so much about putting the military in the barracks and allowing the masses to vote, but it was really more about making elections clean, tying the rulers' hands to manipulate these elections, and sharing power with the opposition. So it's a different challenge. So this is the context, and now I'm going to try to finalize my comments with three challenges of the post-democratic era. So one of them goes back to the topic of populism and the poor. So giving the right to the poor to vote has created fears on the part of the elites that there is going to be, again, radical populist leaders emerging, redistributing wealth and actually abusing power. So think of Hugo Chavez as one clear example of this tendency. Others would say Evo Morales would be, a similar type of leader, although I disagree with that characterization. And one of the interesting aspects of what's going on in Latin America is that countries like Brazil, Mexico to some extent, and Chile demonstrate that there are very clear ways of dealing with these populist threats by establishing social policies that actually help the poor. And in the discussion, I'm going to try to explain what type of policies these are, but it's really tying the hands of the politicians to manipulate social policies in a clientelistic way. And there are ways of doing this, and I think these countries, especially Brazil and Mexico, show that it can be done. So that's one of the big conclusions that emerge from the region. The other, which is somehow an unexpected outcome, is that with democratization, there came an increase in criminal violence in the whole region, but specifically challenging in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and in Mexico. So there has been a really paradoxical, almost, outcome in the sense that the state has been fragmented and seriously challenged by criminal organizations. The challenge is exogenous in part and has to do with the fact that Mexico is so close to the US markets, and also because these criminal organizations are very powerful, and that has nothing to do with sort of internal politics in Mexico. They are very powerful because there is a lot of money involved in the drug trade. So this doesn't relate to the political transition as such, but there is some endogenous factors that have to do with two things. One is the serious corruption of law enforcement institutions, and especially the police, and I also want to come back to this. And this is clearly the case that this is challenging, sort of rule of law and social order in Mexico. And the other is that democratization really fragmented political power. So Mexico is a federal system. There are 32 states with 32 different police corps, and then there are 2,400 municipalities, each of them with their own police. And this just becomes very hard to manage. And this is in part, endogenous to the transition. Guatemala is slightly different because I think that there the challenge is just because the state is exceedingly weak. So criminal violence is something that all over Latin America has become difficult, but I think it's really challenging political instability in a way that is unprecedented. I think Mexico faces a more serious challenge than Colombia for the reason that I've just explained, for this federal setting and the fact that we are so close to the United States. So I want to finish there, and maybe in the questions and answers, I want to talk more about these two aspects. How is it that you can manage to tie politicians' hands not to abuse their power, to distribute resources in a clientelistic way and truly help the poor? And the other is the challenge of police and law enforcement in democracies today.
You want a time out?
Time out. Yes.
Sumitra, thank you very much. Here it is. This is the South African Constitution. I'm carrying it around with me because we fervently believe that the way in which it's crafted is in fact a very important statement of nation building and what we need to become. It of course has a history. It was adopted in this form by the Constitutional Assembly on the 15th of May, 1996. It's a very young document. But it was preceded by a very hard struggle. The African National Congress, formed in 1912, banned in 1960, forced underground, took up arms then, and for 30 years was a banned organization, and membership of the ANC carried the minimum sentence of 5 years. We found ways and means to carry the flag of the ANC, notwithstanding those kinds of risks. It was unbanned on the 2nd of February 1990. Nelson Mandela was released 9 days later. And then the process of rebuilding an organization that was very strong on the ground. The negotiations started almost immediately with the first formal contact in early May of 1990 between a delegation from the ANC, primarily brought from exile, and the then apartheid government. The elections were held under the aegis of a transitional government on the 27th of April 1994, and there was also an interim constitution that guided us. Now, I think one of the reasons why we hold up this constitution is, Jared, the point about this constitution is the issue of values and the ease with which revolutions will be started, but how in that environment you then establish the central core, the binding values that determine what holds people together as they take on regimes, I think is going to be fundamentally important going forward. Our values start with a preamble, recalling the injustices of the past and committing every South African to free up the potential of each one of us. And we have a Bill of Rights that's incredibly strong. We have a complex trias politica. We have a judiciary with an apex court, the Constitutional Court, and they have afforded us the benefit of very significant jurisprudence on rights. One of the first was a case where an individual, in the context of access to health care, sought the provision of dialysis, and the court felt that he could not have an absolute right to it, notwithstanding the Bill of Rights. The second, which was on housing, was fought, and the court granted the need for rights because the rights of the child are seen as paramount, and that was largely fought on the rights of the child. And the third very important bit of jurisprudence was when the court actually stepped in and agreed with campaigners for antiretroviral treatment that a drug, nevirapine, should be availed to South Africans. Now, I'm saying it's a very complex field of jurisprudence, but what the Constitutional Court has done was to uphold the values, and every time in their judgments argue that they couldn't accede to the request because the court is not the fiscal authority. So, in many ways, I think the courts have been absolutely gracious, absolutely strong. Beyond this, I think that there's a difficulty. I am a member of the executive and have been for too long. I've also been a member of parliament for too long, so members of the executive are also members of parliament, and that's in a kind of derived Westminster tradition. It's a complex arrangement. But you know, it's something that the Constitution affords us. And in respect of the legislature itself, my concern is that whereas we started with a lot of fire in the belly about these values, we're a small country, and having sufficient people to occupy those seats in the legislature with quite the same expertise, quite the same determination, is becoming harder and harder. So the key challenge is knowing that we have this amazing document. It was forged in hard struggle. You know, Nelson Mandela was an absolute master. He always said to F.W. de Klerk, the previous president, that he was a man of integrity until there were critical moments, and then he withdrew that. And de Klerk, in a speech just a few days ago, said that whereas the world had this idea that Nelson Mandela was this absolute charmer, in the infighting it was very, very tough. And so it's all manifested. I mean, you couldn't, and this is why in many ways I think that the experience of South Africa should hold out hope to so many other parts of the world, because you had a regime that had premised every decision on the crudest forms of racism and exclusion. And yet you have a constitution that commits every South Africa to a future of non-racialism and non-sexism. And that only happened, you know, it's as though people who governed the country from 48 to 1994 just abdicated, but it wasn't quite like that. There was a complex negotiating process that required binding a nation around values, about seeing what political moments presented themselves, and about taking the opportunities and driving home advantage. You have it. It's superior legislation. It is amended with very, very severe majorities. Certainly the constitutional principles requires 75% and the agreement of all 9 provinces. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to change the fundamental values. What democracy has to do is to continue to work up and work to ensure that we can deliver the kind of South Africa that's articulated in the Constitution. Thanks.
Thank you, Shom. It's an honor to be here. Is this on? Working? I'm going to talk about a sort of grassroots approach that I think is complementary to the high-level constitutional negotiations that Mr. Manuel is describing. I lived in Sierra Leone for 4 years, right after the Civil War ended, and I was just going to start with a story of a woman that I knew when I was there. I'll call her Kadi. She used to sell cigarettes from atop her head in the streets in Kleintown, which is like the eastern end of the capital, Freetown, and occasionally sex for a living, mostly cigarettes. And one night, an off-duty police officer who was drunk asked her for a cigarette for free. You know, he said, "Give me one on credit." She gave him a cigarette. He's a cop. You don't say no. And then for some reason, he asked her for a plastic bag in addition to the cigarette. She didn't have a plastic bag, and he started beating her. And she tried to walk away. Some words were exchanged, and he went berserk. And this was in the street. He beat her, kicked her. She went unconscious. And by the time she woke up, someone had the heartlessness to take what cash she had on her and what cigarettes she had left with her. And so she was empty-handed by the time she woke up. Her boyfriend loaned some money from relatives. They went to the hospital and got some medical treatment. And basically, after this was over, she was interested in some form of compensation, primarily. What they heard about, which they figured was their only shot, was a complaints board that the police department had. So the boyfriend and this woman I'm calling Kadi go to the complaints board. They lodge a report of what happened, and they go back and start checking week after week. A month and a half go by, and nothing has happened. And Kadi hears about this same officer who's still working at the station in Kleintown, bragging that, what is she going to do to me? You know, he's still working. He's bragging about his impunity, basically. And there's an expression in Sierra Leonean Creole. They say, "Na fobiano mo," which means to bear, nothing more. That at this point, and people around Kadi start saying this to her, that at this point, you should just bear what suffering life has dealt you, forget about it, survive, move on. And it strikes me that one of the greatest challenges in transitioning from war to peace, from dictatorship to democracy, is countering precisely that fatalism. If you can begin to solve concrete problems, if you can prove to people that some form of justice is possible, then you can start to rebuild the idea that the wider society is something worthy of loyalty and participation. And indeed, when I moved to Sierra Leone, there was something of a consensus that among the root causes of this brutal 11-year civil war were arbitrariness in government, exploitation, and there was a wide interest in doing something while the slow process of reform and reconstruction was beginning. There was also interest in doing something to provide immediate assistance to people who face injustices in their day-to-day lives. But it was an open question what that assistance would look like. There was only 100 lawyers in the country total. More than 90 of that 100 lived in Freetown in the capital. So if you go outside of Freetown, a sort of lawyer-based model is a non-starter. It's also a dualist legal system, as in much of Africa, where the vast majority of people turn to traditional institutions, and lawyers don't stand up in those traditional institutions. So again, you know, no point in thinking of a kind of conventional lawyer-based legal aid model. And instead, what we did was deploy a front line of community paralegals who are from the communities where they work. We train them in the workings of government, in basic law, and in some simple tools like mediation, advocacy, organizing, community education. And they handle the vast majority of injustices that people bring to these community-based offices. And not unlike a primary healthcare worker who's got a flexible set of tools and is a sort of frontline service provider, similarly, these community paralegals handle the vast majority of cases. Not unlike the health worker who is connected to a hospital and a doctor, these paralegals are connected to a small core of lawyers who can invoke litigation and higher level advocacy in severe cases. And in a country with 100 lawyers, a drop of litigation goes a long way. So for the next 100 cases, people around you remember that you've got someone behind you. There's some vertical network that you're connected to. Kadi, the reason I got to know her was she was one of our clients. She showed up at one of these paralegal offices, and the paralegal takes her statement. He goes and visits the community where it happened and roughly got some confirmation of the story that she told. He called in the police officer who showed up, and the fact that he shows up is itself interesting. It has to do with the sort of color of law in a society where law is so thin that a kind of typed letter on letterhead at least had the effect of having the police officer being interested enough to show up to the paralegal office. They have a conversation. The paralegal basically says, these allegations are serious, and we want to at least follow up with the complaints board to see what's happening with the case, and we would consider potentially prosecution. Police officer is scared enough. He's sort of asking, is there something we could do to settle this? And the paralegal says, well, we'd have to talk to Kadi again. The police officer goes back to Kleintown. We actually don't see Kadi again quickly. What happens in our absence, without the paralegal being around, is they work out a settlement on their own, and there's a public apology outside the police station. The word in Creole is to beg. To beg someone is to apologize, and it's a big deal to have a public apology from a police officer to a sometime prostitute, sometime cigarette vendor, and he paid her 150,000 leones, which is about $50 in compensation. Certainly imperfect justice. I mean, this guy was never held accountable for the cruelty and abuse that he committed. He stayed in office. You could say $50 in objective terms is cheap for the kind of brutality that he committed, but there was some form of redress. And Kadi herself was shocked at the fact that things had come around. She didn't just have to bear the suffering that life had dealt her. There was I meant to show some slides, but maybe I'll skip them. There was a World Bank evaluation of this program. I know there's some economists in the audience, and I can talk a bit about the methodology, but roughly finding that these paralegals are able to squeeze justice out of a broken system. I was going to show some graphs of satisfaction data, and sure, okay. Thank you, ma'am. You see that the vast majority of people who bring cases to this program are happy with what happens. More surprising, the people who are respondents against whom complaints are brought, a significant majority of people are also satisfied with the service, which says something about the fairness of the process. That's at least our theory, is that even if the case may have been against you, there's some fairness happening that people are satisfied. It's a very narrow majority of people who were satisfied from kind of institutional actors, people like this police officer. And we're doing our job if those folks aren't totally satisfied, because part of the point is to hold them accountable. Just to kind of extend the trajectory, since then we've been scaling up this approach, and we've got community paralegal offices. Next, this is what Sierra Leone looks like. It's extremely lush. Oh, thank you, ma'am. Mostly all I have is photographs. This is uh-oh. Yeah. Do you mind hitting the space bar? Just to extend that trajectory, we now are sort of scaling up this approach, and it's multiple organizations who are providing services. This is a paralegal talking to a client. Will this button work now? I just clicked it. This is it's sort of a mediation happening at a community-based office. These were these graphs I was talking about on satisfaction data from the World Bank study. But we are scaling up this approach. There's now paralegal services in 40% of the country. And our hypothesis is that this is a plausibly scalable model for providing primary justice services, which is something that's really crucial for the lived experience of citizens. If you look in the health sector, for example, the Minister of Health, no matter how poor the country, on the first day of their job, needs to answer the question of how am I going to get health services everywhere? How am I going to reach the entire country? For legal aid, there's oftentimes, in many countries, no one even being asked that question. And part of the reason, in our view, is for a lack of good models to provide justice services. So this community paralegal approach, a front line of paralegals backed up by lawyers, it's lower cost. It's something that's plausibly scalable. We're just completing a 5-country study on the impact of community paralegals. And in all of those countries, you see that they had an important role in major radical transitions. South Africa is one of the countries in the study. And organizations like Black Sash started deploying paralegals back in the 1950s and placing them in ANC offices. And they helped people to navigate the Byzantine rules of apartheid. And then through the transition after '94, paralegals played an important role in holding these new services that government was providing, holding them accountable, making sure that citizens could access them. Mr. Manuel mentioned the Neverapine case. That started at a community paralegal office. The plaintiff in that case began at a community paralegal office. Similarly, in the Philippines, sort of a trickle during Marcos, Senator Jose Diokno started Free Legal Assistance Group, and then they sort of are tied to the Power to the People movement and after Marcos falls, you see a flourishing of community paralegal programs. There's a coalition of groups called the Alternative Law Groups. They helped in some of the most major reform legislation that took place after Marcos, helped to actually get it implemented. For example, the Agrarian Reform Act. Similar story in Indonesia, where after the new order falls, you see a flourishing of community paralegals. So we're presently working with organizations in Burma and in Ethiopia, other places where there are transitions, sorry, Egypt, not Ethiopia, other places where there are transitions underway. And our premise is that the high-level political negotiations are absolutely crucial. I mean, no substitute for them. But simultaneously, it's equally important to provide this sort of direct grassroots services to advance justice. Working directly with citizens to squeeze justice out of imperfect and sometimes broken systems.
Thank you, Sumitra. And it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about this very interesting subject of transitions. There's much we can discuss and will discuss, but I'd like just to make 3 opening points. The first has to do with what I consider to be the most important precondition to a successful transition. The second has to do with the importance of democracy in a post-authoritarian society. And the third has to do with constitutions and the issue of elections and complicating getting a sustainable and legitimate constitution. And in doing that, I will draw mostly on my experience in Iraq. I worked for about 5 or 6 years on Iraq, several in Washington, D.C., with the Bush administration, and 2 of those years I was in Iraq, a total of 2 years, including the occupation, which my job was to work with the Iraqis as they were trying to figure out what they wanted these new institutions to build, to look like. So the first point I'd like to make is, about what's an important precondition to a successful transition. And there I will just start with the basics, and that is security. That security is the foundation on which all political and economic progress rests. Now, it seems like a very obvious thing to say, and you might think, well, why would she waste her short 10 minutes by discussing that? Because it's evident to everyone. But I would point out that this misunderstanding of the linkage between politics and security was one of the reasons why we had such difficulty in Iraq. In 2003 to about 2005, we diagnosed the situation in Iraq as being primarily a political problem. We saw that there was huge competition for power and resources, and we thought that was the fundamental essence of the conflict. And I think we were right in that diagnosis. And we surmised that this will only be resolved through political means. A political deal is the only way that you're going to bring down the violence. And as a consequence, we understandably focused a lot on our political strategy. But in doing so, we, I would say, neglected our military strategy. And it was only with the surge in 2000, at the end of 2006 and 7 and 8, that we kind of rectified this and adjusted our strategy to recognize that when people are in situations of severe insecurity, it is very unreasonable to expect that they're going to be able to make big decisions about the nature of the state, that they're going to be in a position to make decisions that have great short-term costs to them. Or to their communities. So again, this understanding this relationship between politics and security is very important. I think if we had more time, we could look at that probably this interaction changes when you get to different levels of insecurity. In Iraq, we're talking about a very severe level of insecurity. As you get more secure, maybe politics takes a more driving role. Certainly in Iraq today, the unstable politics there is having an impact on the security situation. Now, again, you think this is a very obvious point, but look at Libya today. It seems if we've learned this point, we would know that actually the insecure situation in Libya is going to be perhaps the greatest challenge to Libyans who are trying to build new political and economic institutions. My second point has to do with democracy and the importance of democracy. One of the questions we were asked to discuss was, well, is there a difference here in a transition, moving to a democratic or a more authoritarian or a military type regime? And here I would say, just draw on personal experience and say that I became an advocate of democracy for Iraq, not really on ideological grounds, but on pragmatic ones. And there were 2 things that primarily led me to really dedicate myself to working with the Iraqis to try to help achieve a democratic Iraq. The first was a set of trips I made in 2003, shortly after Saddam was forced from power. My job was to go around the country. I think I went to 16 of Iraq's 18 provinces, and I spoke with religious leaders and teachers and tribal leaders, and I asked them, what do you want in a new Iraq? What do you want in a post-Saddam Iraq? And very few of them actually used the word democracy, but almost all of them talked about having a government that was accountable to them. And I think at the end of the day, it is extremely hard to ask people or to expect people who have lived under repressive regimes to then relinquish power to an unaccountable body. And I think that there's been very few credible alternatives to democracy in these kind of post-transition systems. The second reason why I've become an advocate of Iraqi democracy has to do with the divided nature of the Iraqi society. A lot of people will say, well, isn't that a reason why democracy won't work or why democracy is so hard in Iraq? Well, that may be true. It does add specific challenges. But when I look at the nature of that society and the divisions, which are very real in that society, I think that country will hang together in one of two ways. One, under a Saddam-like regime, where an authoritarian ruler uses repression and fear to govern, or two, in a democratic system, or a system, more importantly, that gives every group, however you define it, at least the prospect of influencing the outcome, of helping define the nature of the state, of making an impact on the overall trajectory of the government and the country. And that, again, I think is sort of the essence of a democratic system. Now, on the topic of democracy, one thing very much worth noting from the Iraq experience is that it's not just important whether a government is a democratic one or an authoritarian one. A lot has bearing on what kind of democracy is chosen. What are the particular structures and forms of democracy? In Iraq, many people, I'm sure Dr. Rice is used to getting this question as well, have accused the United States of trying to impose an American-style democracy on Iraq. And if you looked at Iraq's constitution, you would realize that's not really the case at all. It's a very, very different structure. And in working with the Iraqis, one of the things we talk to them a great deal about is where to fall on a very important spectrum. One end of the spectrum is defined by very inclusive government, and another end of the spectrum is very effective government. And that, most governments fall somewhere in between. The Iraqis decided to craft constitutions, the Constitution and other institutions, heavily weighted on the inclusivity side. Now, this made a lot of sense because they were building their institutions in the context of a very vicious insurgency, and it was ultimately these institutions which, in part, helped diffuse that insurgency over time by at least creating an opening for every group to take part in the government. But there has been a cost to that. And that cost has been that the Iraqi government has really struggled to actually deliver things. It's probably, I won't say definitively, but probably the only government in the world where every single party that has a member in parliament also has a position in the cabinet. And so it's been very hard to get things done because the bar is so high for action. And that, of course, has had implications for the credibility of the particular government, but also of the democratic experience. Let me finish with my last point, which has to do with constitutions. And I think most of us would agree that a legitimate, sustainable constitution is maybe the hallmark of a successful transition. And there are many issues specifically we could talk about. Certainly the context of Iraq and Afghanistan have led me to believe that maybe the hardest thing of getting right is the balance between the center and the periphery. In Iraq, they chose a federal constitution on a traditionally highly centralized state. In Afghanistan, it was the opposite. But rather than focus on that, I'd like to say that whatever the challenge or the issue that you're looking at in constitutions, what's very notable to me is that the pressure to have elected representatives write these constitutions actually creates an additional complication. Not an insurmountable one, but an additional one. What do I mean by that? We've all seen, and Jared talked about it at lunch, that early elections often lead to results that are skewed in favor of one particular party, often religious parties, and that those electoral results may not represent the entirety of the political spectrum in the right proportionality. There are lots of good reasons for this. Jared talked about it: institutions, infrastructure, credible voices, alternative visions that are familiar to people. All of those reasons are true. And that in itself is maybe not per se a problem. But what it does create is a challenge on the constitutional front, because these electoral results give those groups a disproportionate say in the structure of the institutions that are created and that are going to really set the course of the trajectory for that country in the years and decades ahead. If you look at Egypt and we think about the consequences of Islamists doing well in that country, there are many, and we could debate, in the interest of we could look at it from US interest or whatever perspectives, but one reality is that the election results have really given a certain frame to the debates that will be had about Egypt's constitution. They will happen largely in an Islamist framework. So what to do about this? Now, most people have said, don't hold early elections. That's the solution. My experience has said that that's not a really realistic prescription, and we've really seen that in the Arab Spring. We've really seen that people in a context of a post-transitional environment, or where you get an authoritarian regime out of power, what people want is legitimacy. And they don't have a way of claiming that they are a legitimate actor in the absence of elections. So elections are the quickest way for people to say, look, there's a reason why I have the right to help usher this country through this particular period of time. I think it's very, very hard to expect countries to accept not having elections quickly. So we need to look for other kinds of prescriptions on this constitutional issue. And there are a few, and maybe Trevor and others will talk about them. One has to do with just setting the bar very high for agreement on constitutions, requiring supermajorities. This is a good solution, except as we saw in Iraq, that can sometimes mean you don't reach agreement on a whole range of issues. You may never actually get a constitution, which of course is destabilizing. Two, you could do what the Iraqis did, is they set dozens of things in their constitution saying, we're not going to resolve this in the constitution, but we're going to ask the Iraqi legislative body to actually opine on this. So there are many, many places where an issue is kicked from the Constitution to a legislative body, and that actually has the virtue of being easier to change over time. Thirdly, you might say, well, you could have a constitutional review, and South Africa did this very well. Iraq had a less positive experience on this. This is basically saying there's a certain amount of time under which this constitution will unfold, and then there'll be an opportunity to revisit it. The experience of Iraq was that certain parties, particularly the Kurds, who had gotten so much more than they ever hoped to get in the constitution, they have no incentive for budging on a single thing. So I think if I were involved in a process like that again, I would look at really having sort of sunset provisions of parts of a constitution that parties would be forced to come to the table again if necessary. This is just a smattering of issues related to the questions that you asked us, but I look forward to our conversation.
Sumitra, may I come in? I'm a bit concerned. Let me go back to our own experience. I mean, in many ways, the unbanning of the organization strike happened very soon after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. A few months earlier, it may have been caught in the Cold War very differently. The one thing I'm very clear about, speaking as one who for all my adult life has been an activist, if our negotiations happened under the guns of outsiders, the outcomes would have been very different. And so the issues of security of outsiders in negotiations, and I go back to what Jared spoke about, what do you call them? Transnational meddlers. I think it may actually apply to states as well. And I think we need to use power incredibly carefully and softly. And if that fails, you get what appears to be unresolvable outcomes that you're seeing in some parts of the world. As an active politician and one very firmly committed to multilateralism, I remain deeply concerned about the use of NATO forces in the wake of Resolution 1973. And I think that Libya will have difficulties because the settlement happened as a consequence of outside guns. And I think if we want to understand constitutions and have the discussion of politics going forward, we need to tone down unilateralism and military force in world affairs. Thanks.
I just say a word or two. I don't at all deny, nothing in what I said suggested that there is a one-for-one applicability to Iraq, to the transitions happening in other parts of the Arab world. There's no question that actually having your regime removed by an outside power versus removing it through peaceful methods by your own people is a very different kind of transition. But I also think that it is perhaps foolish for us not to look to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and think that there are some lessons which are applicable. And the Iraqis actually have spent a lot of time in the Arab world today talking about some of their lessons, because we have to remember that the lessons are not always just the things that went well. They're often you learn from the things that went badly. And a great example has to do with the dismantling of the old regime. The Libyans really took note of the Iraqi experience. This is a problem that all transitional societies have in one degree or another. How do you incorporate the elements of the former regime into the new government? To what extent are those people unable to play any role? To what extent is it important for them to play a role? The Iraq experience was that a lot of people were alienated from that process, and it had a lot of negative implications for the whole transition. The Libyans took note of that very explicitly and decided that they wanted to deal with it in a different way. Now, they're actually still having problems with that very issue. But again, this just goes to point out that while circumstances are not the same in any transition, I acknowledge the big difference between having a foreign power do it and otherwise, but I still think there are things that are useful for us to learn.
Thank you very much for that discussion. I think one general theme that's come out of all of this discussion has to do with both the role of sort of the courts and the legal system, as well as the role of security in some sense as perhaps being a precondition for the operation of the courts, but potentially, the role of the courts in diffusing conflict as well. And I wanted to ask you to each comment on sort of what would be an effective means, institutional framework through which the courts could be more effective, even in these very difficult environments. So, one thing that Minister Manuel mentioned was sort of South Africa's constitutionalism and how the constitutional court had responded in a very, in a very innovative way in many ways to sort of deal with this issue of injustice, a historic issue of injustice, even though it's coming out of the British common law tradition, which would suggest that they should actually be very conservative in many of the things that they did. South Africa, like Hungary and India, have sort of adopted a very sort of permissive view towards public interest litigation, that you can have standing even if you're not sort of a harmed individual. You don't need to create a class, unlike in the United States, of harmed individuals in order to have standing in the courts. Do you think that's a model through which that might be more effective in other settings as well? One question I had for Vivek was sort of related to Meghan's discussion about security. I mean, to what extent do you think this grassroots paralegalism could work? You've demonstrated that it works in Sierra Leone, which is a very difficult post-conflict environment, but in many ways it's a recovering post-conflict environment. Would this work in an environment of a greater instability, or could it be modified so that it could work in such an environment? My question for Professor Sullivan is about democracy and the way it might operate as a means to mitigate conflict. And you mentioned that in Iraq, it gives people a potential voice, but of course, we also worry about the tyranny of the majority. And in Iraq, of course, the majority voter will be, the median voter would be a Shia, and the people who had the guns, who potentially, who were major parts of the Iraqi army ex ante, were from the Sunni population to a large extent, and as a result, they were likely to be more disenfranchised by democratic settlement. Do you think there are ways or lessons that could be learned from Iraq's experience for dealing with groups which have strength today but might lose that strength in a democratic environment? this relates finally to Professor Magaloni's work on how the government can, basically how public policies related to poverty alleviation might be used as a means to kind of align incentives through project design in a way that can ease transition even from single-party rule. And I was wondering if you could each comment about these issues, and then we'll open it up to broader discussion.
Should we go in order? Yes.
Sure.
Okay. So I want to begin with the law enforcement and security. I didn't talk too much about that, and I think that it's interesting. Just now that I think of comparing these cases, that one of the challenges, at least thinking about Mexico, is that the instruments, the actors who were engaged in repressing, the instruments of repression were really were the police. It was not the military. In Latin America, it was very different. The military was directly engaged in the repression, and when the transition happened, the military was removed, was brought back to the barracks, and that creates a very different type of challenge for a system like Mexico, because the operators of repression are still there and operating. That's one thing. The other is that the court system during the authoritarian era was also part of the regime. I mean, the Supreme Court, the PRI had, there were constitutional limits that never really worked for two reasons. One is that the PRI could always change the constitution because it had supermajority, and the other is that in reality, the term limit, things, protections for justices, tenures, and things like that didn't really matter. So the PRI could submit the court to its grip. And that really had a very huge impact on the way laws were enforced all the way down, because the Supreme Court always was the one who was promoting judges to the top. So everybody was looking to the court, and the court was political. And that was really critical. So one of the things that happened in Mexico is that courts were never really actors that restrain abuse by the police. For the most part, these abuses did not have political meaning. I mean, it was obviously, if the regime wanted to use repression, they could do it, to put down guerrillas or to, put down political enemies or whatever, which happened a lot. But really the repression happened on a daily basis to the poor, to those who were trapped in the system, and so on. So there is a study that shows, and this is actually in the post-transition period, this is a study of some jails. In this particular setting, the study shows that more than 90% of the people who were in jail at the time were there for crimes that were less than $100. They never had seen a lawyer, and they never had seen the judge who submitted. So this is when I say this is the real challenge, at least for Mexico, but I see this very similar to Guatemala, is that you have this type of setting with a huge challenge that is exogenous, that comes now from very powerful criminal organizations. No? So this is a completely different setting as what you are describing. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the challenge, we did this list experiment in Mexico. We stratified this sample according to levels of violence. We went to very violent places, middle violence places, and then low violence places where you don't see much happening. And we asked about extortion by the police and extortion by the drug traffickers, and also whether people were turning to the drug traffickers for help. And one of the most interesting findings of the study, I mean, not surprisingly, where there is violence, there is a lot of extortion happening. But the most interesting finding is twofold. One is that a lot of the extortion happens on the hands of the police. And the other is that in low violence places, you see huge extortion from both the drug traffickers and the police. So this is very different to what you have described, but I think it relates to your work in a very nice and interesting way, because I don't think that the institutions, the police, the judges, all these sort of formal institutions are working for solving very minor conflicts in Mexico. And so we have other work that deals with traditional institutions in the indigenous places in Mexico. So this is southern Mexico, Chiapas, Oaxaca, where you have traditional practices. And one of the strong findings now of the work is that matching communities that are similarly poor, indigenous, and so, but that have these traditional practices versus others that don't, you have significantly lower levels of violence in the ones that you have traditional practices. And I was doing research the last 2 weeks. I was in Chiapas, and it's very fascinating. Even witches are involved in the conflict resolution mechanism. But these work. I mean, it works in a way that the court system is not working. No? Your work is really fascinating because obviously the challenge that we say is like, you're not going to export the witches to Mexico City. No? So that is not going to happen. But this type of alternative conflict resolution, I think it's very essential that is defined at the neighborhood level, significantly better than trying to restrain the police. And so that's my comment on this. I didn't comment on the other point, but I think we can.
I wanted to make a point about democracy and a strange point from somebody who earns his keep in politics. People get the governments that they deserve. So in my day job, I head up the National Planning Commission. I want to tie this up to that fascinating talk we had at lunch from Jared. The National Planning Commission is in fact using all manner of social media to communicate with South Africans. We've done a series of animations that are available on YouTube. Now, I'm a cabinet minister, it's my voice. We're inverting the norms and inviting people, not just on YouTube, but we also have it available on a Mobi platform because there are more people who can access it through cell phones. And for people who are interested, it's NPCZA in caps on YouTube. And there are basic messages we're getting through. The first is that the values are contained in our Constitution. The second is that, as I described yesterday, there are a series of challenges that we would put broadly under the rubric of performance deficits on a range of issues. And now we're looking for the enablers in society to drive change. And the first of these is active citizenship. And active citizenship involves people in large areas. There is, in fact, legislative allowance for parents to be involved in education, for communities to take responsibility for the establishment of community policing forums so that you don't have those kinds of stories. For communities to hold their directly elected ward councillors to account, but they're not functioning in poor communities. So part of what we're doing is to enliven those kinds of forums for active citizenship. And through that, and again, you know, it sounds strange, but I'm actually spending a lot of time now trying to motivate NGOs and civil society organizations, including the churches, to be involved, because to get us to where the country arrived in 1990, we had a very broad pan of all manner of faith communities and trade unions and everybody involved. And we're trying to do this again because we need to breathe life into democracy. There's a prospect of maintaining a new form of a transition if we can engage citizenship. And then the third part of it is an effective government capable state. So this is in all of our media. I'm saying that you know, in the courts are there. Sometimes there's a little bit too much activism from our perspective. But if you have active citizens and they understand that it's their responsibility, it's not something you outsource. Similarly, we need to have our legislatures that are seen to be more active than what they are at the moment, and for oversight and accountability to be strengthened. So sometimes it comes from the ground. We're trying to facilitate it from the top as well. And there's an interesting discourse about the quality of democracy, understanding that it's not a cataclysmic event. It's something you have to work on and nurture continuously, failing which it loses meaning because this generation weren't as involved as we were. And that, of course, is a risk. Thanks.
I agree with the premise of the question that the formal judiciary potentially plays a really crucial role, even early on after a transition. I have a few thoughts on the formal judiciary. One is to look past those formal courts to where else the law is. And Beatriz mentioned, there's legal pluralism, not just in Sierra Leone. In most countries in the world, there's that situation where you have primary adjudication happening by courts that don't fall in line with the formal judiciary. Sometimes they're hybrid and they're integrated, and a lot of African countries have these hybrid courts where they're traditional, the structure is traditional, but yet there's a mechanism for appeal into the formal courts. Sometimes they're completely parallel systems that are autonomous. But making a sort of national level vision about how that's going to be integrated into one national justice system ultimately, and how are we going to live with this pluralism? What are the connections between those systems? What support do those institutions need that are dealing with oftentimes a vast majority of problems? I think that's one often neglected area in terms of court reform. Secondly is the justice that the administrative state delivers. Oftentimes the rule of law conversation is really focused on the judiciary, but for the lived experience of people, it's often things like a welfare benefit gets denied, or there's a problem where the local healthcare clinic is charging a fee and they're not supposed to be doing so, or I can't get my driver's license without a bribe. Those aren't things that belong in a formal court. There needs to be cheap, fast, fair mechanisms for handling grievances within the administrative state. And in most sort of advanced democracies, that body of administrative law is a crucial part of how you make sure that policy and practice are close together. And yet in many countries, this whole area of administrative law and the mechanisms of handling grievances within the body of public administration is really sort of under-attended, not much attention paid, not much study, not much reform energy. So I think that's another sort of important area. And then the other basic point, which maybe won't be a surprise coming from me, is that I feel like when you invest in courts, you ought to invest in independent justice services, because the premise of a court is that this is one place in society where power is supposed to be left at the door and it's an equal forum. And the point is we judge based on reason, based on law, based on the merits of a case, and that just isn't the reality if you have one side represented by counsel and the other side not. So any investment in court systems needs to be complemented with some investment in some form of independent justice services, so that the less powerful parties that have cases before courts have a shot at a fair hearing. Third thing I'll mention is monitoring compliance. Costa Rica has this really innovative mechanism where they've got a body in their Supreme Court who calls parties after fundamental rights decisions happen to track what went on. Because, I mean, I've just been living in Delhi for the last year, and South Asia has a situation where you've got lots of progressive Supreme Courts and lots of gaps in compliance. And ultimately, over the long run, this undermines the judiciary altogether if you've got judgments that aren't getting followed. And so starting by what Costa Rica is doing, which is tracking the data on what's actually happening, they aggregate these statistics and publish them. And so it turned out that the Ministry of Education was only complying in 12% of the cases, and then that caused some fruitful ruckus and some fruitful political tension. So I think that basic data tracking, which is missing in most places, would be useful. And then just to answer your question about paralegal approach, would it be plausible in even less stable contexts? I mean, my short answer is yes, I think so. The whole point of it is that it needs to be context responsive. So what community paralegals look like in Sierra Leone would be different than what they are going to look like in places like Egypt and Burma. But these demands are coming to us from people who've been working in civil society for decades, who really feel that now there's an opening. And one of their greatest priorities, for example, Hossam Bagat is a really respected human rights activist in Egypt, probably one of the most respected kind of human rights organizations. And he's done for 10 years high-level litigation and advocacy, publishing a report, bringing it to the government. What he's most interested in doing now is getting out into the countryside and opening up grassroots offices that respond to the day-to-day problems of people. And certainly paralegals in Egypt will look very different. In fact, there'll probably be lawyers, because there isn't this shortage of lawyers in Egypt. But community justice services in Egypt will look quite different from what they do in Sierra Leone. But yes, I do think that this is an important approach to consider during that transition phase because of what I had mentioned initially, which is building this sense that you've got a stake in society, that justice is actually possible. And reforms are slow and imperfect, and you need to kind of tend to wounds of people hurt by broken systems not yet fixed. And in the long term, reform depends on a more empowered polity.
Lots I could say on the question of the rule of law and justice, particularly in the context of the Arab world, because I would say that that is a more important concept, justice, than really anything else in the Arab world, and maybe one which should have taken a higher priority in terms of institution building. But again, it gets back to the issue of security. It's very hard to build these kinds of institutions in a situation of very, very severe insecurity. But in the interest of time, let me just answer the question you directed to me about majoritarianism. And that gives me the chance just to underscore the second point that I was making. It's not just about, is it a democratic system or not a democratic system? The details really do matter as to whether that kind of democracy will ultimately be a vehicle for stability or not. And it's true that many countries going through a democratic transition, there's a high correlation with conflict and violence for a lot of reasons, many of them having to do with how people mobilize people in those systems. But Iraq is not a majoritarian democracy. And in fact, that was part of the challenge, is talking to people initially about, well, democracy doesn't mean that the majority gets to have its way every time. In fact, that's a minority of democracies. And there are a large number of things in the Iraqi constitution that try to ensure that the majority cannot actually govern without acquiescence from minorities. That doesn't mean there's consensus about everything and all the most important issues, but just on things like the prime minister. The prime minister is voted on by parliament, and if you have to have 2/3 of the parliament approve the prime minister, this has literally, in the last few years, meant that the Sunni minority and the Kurds have been able to hold up the prime minister, the preferred prime minister of the Shia group, and an alternative prime minister was ultimately chosen. So these mechanisms have been able to demonstrate, and again, I'm not pretending this is a perfect system, and there's many people who, with some very good reason, say that minorities don't have sufficient say in the process, or that the Constitution is not being adhered to sufficiently. But there are certainly a whole variety. I just gave you one example, but there's at least a dozen of ways in which Iraq's Constitution was written so that the majority would not have the power to govern without acquiescence from the minorities. This, again, has created a lot of objection from the majority, which actually feels like it should be able to govern more freely, that they feel you win an election, you govern, you lose an election, you sit out. Well, that's not actually how it works in Iraq, given the weight that they put on inclusivity. The current prime minister, there's a lot could be said about that, but he basically says, I'd like to move to a majority system, because he feels like he's being held accountable for the fact that he can't get anything done because he's not in a position where he and his party can make policy. And there are lots of points of where all the parties and the groups don't have consensus on big issues. So I really wanted to underscore that the nature of the system, the details, really do matter.
Okay, at this point, we actually don't have much more than 5 minutes. But it'd be lovely to have at least 1 or 2 questions from the floor. Or I can keep going. So while people are thinking, one thing I'd like to actually ask was about this issue about fatalism and this issue about fear. It's something actually that Minister Manuel brought up yesterday when when I asked him about his activist career and what was the one thing he learned. So I was wondering, on one hand, many societies, people are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to approach the courts. They're afraid to, approach to vote their consciences. And in many respects, there's good reasons to be afraid. And it seems like, you can try to mandate that. You can get the message out, but what's the most effective means to change that equilibrium? That equilibrium where people don't do things, and as a result, things don't change. it seems like Mexico had some experience doing that in a particular way, South Africa, Sierra Leone, and Iraq. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that issue as well.
This is a very interesting question, and I'm going to reflect on poverty reduction because of the experience in Mexico. So one of the things people were exceedingly afraid in Mexico, and especially talking about poor people, is voting the wrong way. And it's never really, I mean, during the era of strong authoritarian hegemony, a strong hegemony by the PRI, it was the case that they were observed. I mean, in the countryside, there was no real secrecy of the ballot, so maybe the fear, obviously came from the fact that they were being observed. And there was a credible threat that if you didn't vote the right way, you were going to be removed from the benefits and especially the promise to continue to be member of the inner circle, I mean, the club, the spoil system, no? So it was a promise to receive more benefits from the state. And it's interesting, even after years in which clearly the secrecy of the ballot had been established, and after a lot of international observers, civil society, political parties being able to monitor the ballots all over, that fear remained, and it still remains. It's interesting. So one of the things that has happened in the transition, and it's that they created this program, Oportunidades, which is a conditional cash transfer that is given to the women in exchange of them taking their kids to schools and keeping them in and health clinics. No? Is that they clearly put there, it doesn't depend your benefit, and it's in every single brochure, every single act that the program does, it says your benefit does not depend on the way you vote. And it's every time they are, all the, the implementators of the program are asked to say this doesn't really depend on the way you vote. And the program was created, the first one in '97, although now it's very, very expansive. So the first elections, 2000, people, despite the fact that they told them, your vote, you won't be sanctioned, they still were afraid, obviously. And it was really, it took like learning. So they learned that there was a transition, the PRI left, and then the PAN came, and the benefits remained, no? And so, and I bet it takes a lot of threats on the ground, say, if you don't do this, I'll remove your benefit, and then they learn, they truly cannot do this, no? So today, I think that people finally have learned that, I'm talking just about this benefit. There are a lot of other benefits the government gives that can really be removed. But I think that with respect to this entitlement, which has become an entitlement, people have learned that it's not going to be a way. And still, the politicians are, I was in Chiapas, as I said, 2 weeks ago, and I learned there is elections this year, and the operators of Oportunidades, they told me, they're offering me 40,000 pesos to campaign for this party and that party. I was super interested, to find out, and there was actually a prize, so that they were offering, but it's very different from the past. One thing is to campaign and say, if this is really brought by the PRI, or let's say this is really brought by the PAN, but it's very different to campaign on the basis of I'll threaten you. But the politicians are still doing, and I hear that, they take, okay, give me your identification to voting and your name. And that's all they can do, because they cannot really monitor you, but they are really asking people to sign so that they create the impression that they can really know. So it's a very interesting question. And my answer to this is that it's really taking a lot of time to ease that fear. But it has improved. Yes.
I see Maria, and I'm very scared. I want to make a point in just a few seconds. The key challenge, I think, is to ensure that we can maximize participation. And Esther Duflo, co-author of Poor Economics, talks of the impediments to improving on the quality of life. And these are ignorance on the side of people and public servants alike, ideology and inertia. And I think if we begin to understand that and engage with it differently, we'll have more people involved in improving on the quality of life of everybody. The idea of governments that do or don't do, and people are enlivened once every few years for elections, I think is a failed model, and that's what we have to counteract. We have very good turnouts for national and provincial elections, even for local government elections, but it's clearly not enough. We need to be doing a lot more between elections. And that, I think, is giving a qualitative feel to democracy. That's quite different from what the world knows now. Thanks.
A couple thoughts on the question of fatalism. Sierra Leone, 2003, the brutality had thankfully ended, and it was a matter of dysfunction and distrust. I mean, another quick story, there was a bridge going through 4 villages that had broken, and but this was it went over the stream that these 4 villages depended upon for drinking water. And so the community, with a self-help attitude, was trying to rebuild the bridge on their own with palm trees. And the truck drivers would get slowed down because of that, because the work was in progress, and they would curse out the community members who were rebuilding the bridge. And the community came to us, and what surprised me most is what they asked for. What they said was, they didn't even say anything about the bridge or the Sierra Leone Roads Authority, didn't mention it. What they said was, could you talk to the drivers' union to get the drivers to stop cursing us out, because it's embarrassing, it's humiliating to us that they curse us out while we're trying to fix the bridge to protect our water source. We did talk to the drivers' union, but we also went with them to the Sierra Leone Roads Authority, and it wasn't malice in that case. They just didn't have the information, and they came and fixed the bridge, and the community was shocked before the rains fell, and the community was shocked. And I think one answer, when you are on the dysfunctional end of the spectrum, is solve concrete problems. If you can start getting the government, finding willing agents within the government to start solving concrete problems, it doesn't have to be everywhere all at once. That's how you start to grow a little bit more trust, a little bit more sense that this endeavor is worth participating in. You mentioned participation. On the more brutal end of the spectrum, I think honoring the courage of people who do take great risks. I mean, I would be curious whether, to what extent, Mr. Manuel, for you and others who bravely resisted apartheid, was the global divestment movement a source of some sense of international solidarity? I mean, I think similarly, there's this group, Avaz, which has got 10 million members around the world from every country, and when people are courageously resisting brutality, there's a show of support financially by this is someone mentioned transnational meddlers and the question of multilateralism. This is the people's version of multilateralism. It's not governments meddling. It's showing some sense of international solidarity among citizens in the world, and honoring the courage of those who are standing up. It's a small thing that one can do from the outside, but it's worthwhile.
And I'll respond with maybe 2 sentences, judging from the look on Maria's face. I'll just end where I started, and that has to do with accountability. And I'm used to working in societies where people's fears had to do with disappearing overnight, stepping out of line, and that was the last action that you took. And so this is a very severe level of fear and instability, and not for all people, but for many people, a damper on just participation in the political system, but trying to be a catalyst for change. So I would say building institutions of accountability and building institutions of justice and recourse have to be at the heart of addressing those fears and those impediments to citizenry.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for a wonderfully simulating panel, and thank you very much for coming.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations. 改变世界。Change organizations.
Change the world.